So this webinar, is meant to share the visions and aims of FACE generally. As you may know, so it depends, you may or may not know that FACE 2020 was meant to be, so we planned it to be an in-person, so a live physical conference. And it was meant to happen on June 8th. And then COVID happened and we thought we wanted to cancel it, but we decided to sort of change the focus of FACE for this year. And then have this sharing. So I want to go, as quickly as possible through the visions and aims of FACE, sort of to reintroduce everyone to what FACE is about, what we've done, why we set ourselves up, and what we intend to do in future. Just a few housekeeping rules. I've already mentioned that I'm going to talk for I hope a maximum of 25 minutes, have 25 minutes for questions. Note that the session is being recorded. Your microphones are on mute and I believe you are unable to unmute them. If you have any questions or comments about FACE or about this session, generally click, the link has been sent to you with the join-in details. Use the link to ask any questions that you have. We have a hashtag Twitter on Twitter, FACE 2020, so hashtag FACE 2020. You're not mandated to use the hashtag, but if there's anything you want to mention on Twitter, use the hashtag and we will really appreciate that. And also a reminder that we do have 4 other seminars this week. So 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th seminar throughout the, so from Tuesday to Friday. If you... No, it's not. Sorry, I have been interrupted. So we have 4 other seminars, and if you haven't, please do sign up to those. Okay, so very briefly, what is FACE? So FACE stands for Forever Africa Conference and Events, and it's essentially a student and staff collective. It's based in Bristol, which means that this is where it started, but it's not supposed to be only a Bristol-based thing. Sort of the idea or the framing for it is interdisciplinary. So we have a cross-discipline of people who work within and for FACE. It's Pan-African, it's decolonial, which means it's anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and Afro-feminist, and it's student-centered. So while it is quite academic in nature, it's also it's not meant to be something that students may want to attend, but students are essentially the focus of what FACE is doing. So FACE is comprised of a student and staff team. So the Bristol-based team is made up of student members and staff members, and also has an international advisory board from across the world. So we have members in South Africa, Nigeria, Canada. I think those are the main countries where we have people, and those are our details. So that's a Twitter, Instagram, our website. Please do check out the website, our Facebook, and our email. So if you want to communicate anything to FACE, use our email address. Okay, so the first question I'd like to address is, why did we set up FACE? What exactly were we, sort of driving impetus in setting up FACE? So it's specifically to think about the needs of Black students and staff that go beyond things like equality, diversity, and inclusivity. And anyone who knows me a little bit well and has read anything I have written, there's always for me this idea or strong, well, let's say idea that EDI probably doesn't go far enough in what we are trying, or in what needs to be done to ensure racial justice in UK higher education. So these are sort of a few stats. There are lots and lots of stats. And if you go to our website, there's a few documents and articles where we put much more stats than we have here. But if you think about these three graphs that we have on the one hand, we have what we call the student attainment gap. I'm a little bit skeptical about using that phrase, attainment, because it suggests a deficit with the students rather than something that the universities or higher education itself or education institutions as a whole need to improve. So as you can see, when you see the sort of the differences between students who qualify with a first or a 2-1, and this is corrected for their entry qualifications. So that means students who all got the same sort of results when they came into university, and then how they're whether or not they're more likely to get a 2-1 or a first class. That means that something happens at university. That means they don't get a 2-1 or first class. And then think about the distribution of staff. Again, you look at the difference between, or the disaggregation of the non-white populations. It's not exact. Or you look at the what we call the ethnicity pay gap. Again, you can see that the differences range, and then for Black populations, so that's people with an African background, an African Caribbean background, you've got the lowest numbers across the board. So representation, student attainment, and pay gap, you have the lowest numbers across the board, which means we need to do more than just diversity. We need to do more to center our discourse on justice, if you want to term it that way. We need to do more to center our theories of justice on what the experiences of the Black population within university is. There's also the question of the curriculum, which is kind of my own focus. And it's about a complete absence. So we already talked about the absence of Black representation among students who get first and 2-1s, the absence of Black populations in representation. But also you think about the curriculum, the absence of Africa and African descended people from reading lists, from the core content, from the staff body, from the student body, from the walls, from the buildings. And the only way, I would say the only place in which African descended populations in Africa and her diaspora are really represented are in the silence about it. So when we say things like diversify your reading lists, what usually happens, or what sometimes happens, is that you have more non-white populations, but still not that many more of African sort of scholars. So how many, you think about our reading list, how many scholars from the continent of Africa are being cited in our reading lists or in the curriculum? When we talk about, international, are we always talking about an equal representation of Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, or are we just thinking about certain areas that we think of as international? So I think the other question for me, or that I would like to address today, is why we have, sorry, I've skipped forward, why we have decided to use a Pan-African framing. So when we came up with the idea of face, we were thinking of going, either saying, a Black group, or in some way like African without the pan. But because I think it's quite important that we link whatever we're doing to things that have happened before. We shouldn't sort of always presume that we're doing something that is entirely new. So I just want to go very quick history of what Pan-Africanism is and why we've decided to use it as our framing for face. So there are various global movements, and it should be noted that they did not, so while there's quite a lot of overlap, these are sort of slightly differentiated movements that arose in the mid 19th century, and they connected the racist struggles, so the anti-racist struggles in the West with anti-colonial struggles and anti-apartheid struggles movements in Africa. And I have some suggestions on the PowerPoint. I think from Selma to Soweto is a very good one, because it explains how people who are, involved in the civil rights movement in the United States engage in a disinvestment program in the United States to ensure that companies who were investing in apartheid South Africa had to withdraw their investments in apartheid South Africa, and which in some ways contributed to the end of formal practice of apartheid. So there's always been a history of cross-African diaspora engagement or joint collaboration. And the sort of general framing of that is Africans, and broadly defined, have a common, and again, the word common in this case, I always say it's broadly defined because it's not exact, it's common, it's related, it's connected, but it's not an exact history and destiny. And Pan-Africanism is supposed to promote intellectual, political, economic, and cultural cooperation that would form the basis of African unity. And this has been theorized by lots and lots of people. But we should also note, and this is where it gets slightly problematic, that there are two distinct branches which emerge in the 1960s, and there are lots of people I have intellectual conversation. I think at least one of them is signed up and listening to me about, the way in which those two distinct branches, how they emerge and how they sort of become slightly problematic for the practice of, or the idea of Pan-Africanism. So you have, on the one hand, what we call the Monrovia Bloc, which is the idea that African countries have to be independent and follow a Westphalian sort of state. So try to be democratic, liberal capitalist states, model themselves on European states, and that would be the way in which they will carry this Pan-African theme forward. And then you have the Casablanca Bloc, which one of the foremost proponents of that would be Kwame Nkrumah, the late Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. And the idea was more United States of Africa. So these two, it should be noted that these two branches, they are quite distinct. Although they're similar, they are quite distinct. So what we have, say for example, with the African Union, is very much the first branch. And we lean towards the second branch a little bit more than the first branch. So we're not really interested in speaking to heads of state. We're more interested in what's going on at the grassroots. So whether or not the state survives is not as important as whether or not the people, all the people, can be sort of attain some sort of personal equality, justice. The state itself, if the survival of the state is predicated on the destruction of its people, then there's no point in the survival of the African state. And that's sort of my kind of idea. And it sort of slightly resonates with what Malcolm X has said about, a Pan-African framing, the idea that when the African continent is independent and you can see that all its people prosper. And, I think the word prosper itself carries sort of slightly different connotations, but let's go with prosper as a, personal development, not in a very sort of monetary value kind of way, but personal development. That would mean that wherever anyone who has an African background is to be found, then there's going to be less likelihood of, them being treated in a malicious manner. And then you can see, in a way, how the history of Pan-Africanism links into the Black Lives Matter movement. So you have the idea that there is almost a shared experience, but I will come to that in a bit. Because, and this is why there is, for us, an overlap between Pan-Africanism and decolonial, the decolonial approach. So decolonizing of the university, of the curriculum, whatever however you would like to term that. But of course, they're not exactly the same thing. And it is possible to try and decolonize without taking into account the specific experience of Black people within higher education. But then you begin to see, if you think about the history of, sort of the anti-slavery movement, the decolonization movement across the African continent and across the Pan-African world, or think about, the Rhodes Must Fall movement, or, it started in South Africa, and then you've got, Oxford, and before, after, or sort of almost linked to that, you then have massive decolonization movements happening, student movements, why is my curriculum white, why is my professor not Black, happening in the UK. So there has always been that connection. And that's why for us, we don't want to say we're coming up with something new, but we also recognize that we have moved forward, but there's still quite a lot to be done within UK higher education. And we also have to think about the place of the university in what we're doing. So the history of the university, the present of the university, and the possible future of the university, and the idea of possibility of multiversal or multiple knowledge systems. Can they exist within the university? And this is when you think about the multiversity and the university. Uni suggests that there's only one knowledge system, while multiversity suggests that there are possibly different knowledge systems. But the other thing I'd like to point out, and this is another reason why we frame ourselves as Pan-Africanist, is we want to make clear that there is a distinction between being anti-racist and promoting African and African-descended knowledges and peoples. Because anti-racism or racism is what we're fighting, but ourselves, that's what we're promoting. So what happens after, let's say, racism dies? What happens? What kind of world do we build? And that's really what FACE is concerned with. We are concerned with the end of racism, but we're also concerned with the possibility of a much better world. If we end racism and do nothing else, my fear is that racism will reform itself or new oppressions will arise. However, if we theorize while we're ending racism on what kind of world we want to see that will have justice for everyone, then it's more likelihood that what we're doing will have value. Or in the words of Imani Perry, she says, racism is terrible, but Blackness is not. Blackness is an immense and defiant joy. And that's kind of, sort of speaks or quite strongly resonates with what we're doing. So it's the idea that we need to think about, in a decolonial way, but also centering Pan-African knowledges. The idea that even though we've seen what we consider to be the end of empire, there's still epistemological mechanisms in place to maintain those knowledge hierarchies. So while decolonial thought is important, it's good to talk about decolonization, but we should also understand that we also need to think about the epistemic tools we're trying to use to decolonize. Do we have the words? Do we have the language to actually decolonize? And wouldn't it be, our approach is to think about centering the knowledges that we're trying to build up. So rather than trying to use the knowledges that we're saying have created this hierarchical structure to liberate, why don't we use the knowledges that have been suppressed? So is it possible to use the language of oppression to bring about freedom? And I suspect that would be slightly difficult. But there's also a question of how do we do this within the university? So how do we use the language of the university and the mechanisms of the university to liberate within the university, where the university structure itself is designed to create certain knowledge hierarchies? How do we do this? We do, like I said, we have to understand and connect with the history that we are trying to follow on from. But I also understand, and this really came up a lot this really came up a lot in our last conference, FACE 2019. And like I mentioned, the Pan-African framing, and that's why I think it was important to mention that there are two distinct branches, and we're not Pan-African like the AU, like the African Union. Okay, the African Union is doing good work. I would accept that they're doing good work, but we're not framing our Pan-Africanism exactly like the African Union. But we also need to understand that there are intra-distinctions within this concept of Pan-African. We're not, and that's why I struggle with the idea that, when Pan-Africanism says that Africans have a common destiny and history, because it's a common one, but it's not exact. And we need to understand that people have different histories, different cultures, different interests, different desires, different goals within that. And we will always struggle with, as with any group, any organization, anything, we will always struggle to give equal attention to all the intra-distinctions. But there are also intra-oppressions within Pan-Africanism. And this is, one of the reasons why I do like to say, there is the distinction, and I think Pan-Africanism has been utilized. Pan-Africanism has been utilized in many ways to suppress, to silence. Nanjala Nyambola, Kenyan writer, calls what we sometimes call Pan-Africanism. She says it's Man-Africanism. It's within Pan-Africanism you can find the suppression of women, suppression of the LGBTQ community. There's a lot of elitism. There's a lot of classism within Pan-Africanism. Only people who have gone to certain schools can speak about Pan-Africanism. That's one of the things I think is quite important for us, where if we're directing our thoughts inward, that we understand that we need to subvert the intra-oppressions as well. So while there's a history, we need to drop the things that haven't worked, the things which are oppressing, the things which are, holding this sort of movement back, cannot go with us into the future. There's also the question of, and I've already sort of alluded to that, how far can we go with this decolonial Pan-African thought within a more or less colonial university? Which is why for us, FACE is an epistemological space. It exists within the university, but it's not essentially of the university. So what are aims? I've sort of given a quite rough background, and I realize that I'm close, quite quickly running to the end of the time I have allotted myself. So our aims are, since it's an epistemological space, we're trying to connect people and work. And from our previous conferences, there's lots of, we've got lots of feedback of people who have decided to work in a cross-disciplinary or transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary way because they've attended our conferences and then they've met people who they want to work with across disciplines, sometimes within disciplines, but in a sort of more creative way. So it's about asking questions that are not usually asked, so not trying to subvert the normal sort of cycle of these are the kind of research questions that we ask, or these are the kind of people that we always work with, or I have to work with, this sort of person. So by making this epistemological space, which we hope to, we hope to continue to improve, but we also hope that, people come to this space and are able to create new sorts of knowledges that would ensure knowledge democracies and subvert or disrupt the knowledge hierarchies that we have created and have been maintained for quite a long time. One of our key focuses is addressing the awarding gap. So I call it the awarding gap rather than the attainment gap. Because like I said, attainment suggests knowledge, a deficit on the part of the population who are not getting all the first and two ones. And if you think about it, if these students had the same results as other students when they came in, then it's definitely not their fault that they're not getting first and two ones. So there are lots of ways in which we've tried to address it, and some things I would suggest are almost sort of beyond so we cannot sort of redesign higher education with FACE 2020, but we intend to in some ways, by asking questions that are not really always being asked. So, you know, things about types of research questions that are not often given value. And lots of people have said to me, and, you know, there's lots of at least anecdotal evidence, apart from sort of like empirical evidence, that there's certain types of research questions, research topics that don't have the same value. So lots of people who research Africa from their own African perspective, so they would say there would be sort of suggestions that, well, you're not being objective if you're researching Africa, but nobody else says that in any other sort of sector. So if you are say German researching Germany, you're unlikely to be told, well, you cannot be objective about that. But if you're an African researching anywhere in Africa, then there's suggestion that maybe you're being subjective, especially when you're asking questions in a different way, which arise totally because of, you know, what you know. And it is quite disconcerting when you know something to be true, like beyond a shadow of doubt. All of the people you know this to be true, but you then put forward a research question, and that's, well, that's not true because it's not true here, but it's true for lots of, you know, millions of people in on a different continent. So by creating this sort of space, we hope that, you know, more Black students will consider academia, but we hope to support them through academia, so foster a sense of belonging. And celebration is definitely one of our aims. And if you've attended any one of our previous conferences, you will see this. And I don't think we should think of celebration as frivolous. You know, going again back to the, you know, to the words of Emmanuel Perry, Blackness is immense and defiant joy. If you feel uncomfortable in higher education, you do not want to stay. But this celebration of ourselves, of knowing that we're not fighting, you know, we're not just about fighting racism, but about, you know, imagining a world that is much different, much better, much brighter than what we have now, then, and thinking or understanding that within academia, there's space for us to do that imagining, because I think critical thinking is very important to liberation. Then I think celebration plays a vital part in actually addressing all the aims and goals that we have set for ourselves. So I don't see celebration itself as a frivolous aspect of our aims, even though I put it last. I think it's quite important that we do celebrate what we have. So what have we done? We've got two previous conferences. So we had FACE 2018, which was our launch conference, and FACE 2019. Theme of which was Centering Pan-African Knowledges in a Pluriversal World, the Pan-African Multiversity. So the outcome document of FACE 2019 is what's going to be the topic of discussion tomorrow. So if you haven't signed up for tomorrow's webinar, please do. So we're going to have Sheila Bamu Jemere, who's a graduate of the Law School, University of Bristol, Aisha Thomas, who's a Black teacher in Bristol, so one of the very few Black teachers who we have in the city of Bristol, and Dr. Furaha Asani, who is a brilliant scientist. So we're going to be talking about the outcome document tomorrow. We also have the Student Award, which will be that will be happening on Friday. And like I said, we've already had great feedback from delegates and the FACE team on, you know, what we've done, how that has revolutionized people's thinking about academia. So I've got so many people, you know, wanting to do a PhD now because they're going, so I can actually ask that question. I can actually do this sort of research. I can actually sort of go beyond, you know, what my discipline has said, because this is what we're talking about, or what the university should be, is about producing new and vital knowledge for improving humanity. It's not about regurgitating what we've done before, or, you know, just sort of saying it in a different way. So that's what we have done, what we want to do next. So the Student Award, which I said we're talking about on Friday, our hope is that we continue to open it up. So the Student Award on Friday was only for University of Bristol students. So depending on, because COVID has sort of put a damp on quite a lot of things, but depending on how that goes, well, in the future, because we don't know what's going to happen with COVID. Nobody knows. We hope to increase the scope of the award so that it can go, well, the hope is eventually everybody around the world will be eligible. So all students around the world would be eligible for the FACE award, but we're probably going to open it gradually, especially with COVID. So over this summer, we're hoping to invite African academics. So we're going to have webinars across the summer, and hopefully in the future. So it's something that we hope to continue doing, having so platforming scholars from places that don't usually get platformed within Africa to come and speak to us. So keep an eye open, watch this space. The Sankofa trip, which we'll be talking about on Thursday, again, sign up for that. So we're planning across Africa. I'm really excited about this one. So across Africa road trip from Cape Town to Cairo by road. We're also asking for online contributions. Again, you know, it's this idea of making knowledge available, producing different types of knowledge. And FACE 2021, we will be focusing on decolonization, intellectual Pan-Africanism, future of the multiversity. So those are a few of our plans. We do have so many plans. I'm really excited. And I, again, want to just sort of give a shout out to the FACE team, all the students who give up their time, their labor, their creativity. They don't get paid, and they do this work with so much enthusiasm. I'm really grateful to them, and also the International Advisory Board. That we've got lots of academics, lots of professionals from other sectors, and they also give up so much of their time unpaid. So you think about it, you know, people are giving up their time because they think this is worthwhile, because they think they can make a difference. They think that this is something which is worth doing. So I appreciate them, but I also sort of use that as an example of, you know, how much this has value to us. Yeah, and I think that's me done. I've slightly gone over the time I intended to. We started a little bit later. Than I intended to, because I was signing people in. But if you do have any questions, can you put it on the Slido link? I do have a few questions which are I'm going to try and address here. But if you do have any questions, please put them into the Slido thing, and I'm going to stop sharing, I think. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so the first question is about FACE doing some outreach work outside the University of Bristol. That's definitely one of our plans. We've been in talks with a few organizations on how to do. So some students have said they wanted to go into schools, into primary and secondary schools, and these are some of the things that we're working on. Again, with COVID, it's been a bit haphazard trying to get those plans in place. But hopefully these are things that we'll be able to do as soon as possible. Yeah, yeah, some people have missed in registration. There's a lot of that. Yes, someone asked about the slides. I will send the slides out with the slides are going to be available online, and you will probably receive the slides if you've signed up for this particular event. But I will definitely put them somewhere online. If you found out about this event, then you're definitely going to find out where the slides are. But I will email the slides to the people who have attended this webinar, because I think that's the easiest way to go with it. Are there any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, I think the chat is disabled just in case you're trying to use the chat. But if if you want to ask a question, please use the Slido link. And I should say that this is using Zoom is, you know, this I'm practicing while I'm doing this, so it's okay. Somebody said thank you. You're welcome. So I think because we're at 12:40 now, and like I said, I will monitor the Slido link. Ooh. Okay, somebody said, what has been the biggest development since last year's FACE conference? I would say that would be the outcome document. And I really, really encourage you to sign into tomorrow's webinar where we will be discussing. So the plan with the outcome document, it's a really glossy and lovely document, by the way, and that's slightly irrelevant. But the plan was to have print copies of the outcome document from last year, and to have them available for all delegates of FACE 2020. But again, with COVID, that couldn't happen. So the outcome document, and I sort of don't want to preempt tomorrow's webinar, but the outcome document is essentially a discussion of, or a summary of what we discussed at the last conference. The last conference was highly focused on the multiversity. So how do you bring African knowledges within the education system? And the document itself is a summary of that. So and we looked at the entire education system as well. So we're thinking of from primary to higher education, because it would be, as is often said, slightly ridiculous to decolonize higher education where people have no knowledge of any sort of African knowledges in primary and secondary schools, and then in tertiary education, you're going, well, now we're going to decolonize the education. So there's lots of suggestions within the outcome document. And again, that will be made freely available to everyone, the outcome document. And I think it's a quite important production that we have done as FACE. Yeah, now questions are pouring in. And yeah, so so this is a big, I would say quite a big question. So can we as African academics trading and working in the UK be the right instruments in creating new forms of knowledge when we're steeped in the context here? I would say simple answer, no. We're probably not the right instruments. And this is why, so with something like the summer of African lectures, we're trying to platform African voices because we're so steeped in the context here. So when I started, thinking about decolonization, I was initially focused on decolonization in Africa, but I realized that by working here so much, my knowledge was almost in a way historical, so my knowledge of the African context. But we also have a privilege by being here that we're more likely to be able to platform the voices that need to be heard. So it's not for us to, in many contexts, it's not for African academics within this context to do the speaking, but to ensure that African academics and African knowledge producers, so not just academics, but any producers of knowledge, African producers of knowledge, get the right platform. So we can ask the right questions, but sometimes it's not really our job to do the speaking. Yeah. Let's see. Next question. What's the best way to increase university engagement with African academics? Should there be quotas for reading lists and library purchasing? I would say yes and no, because I'm slightly skeptical of quotas, because quotas are supposed to be, I would say, basements. So you're saying have at least this many, but then they become ceilings. You say, well, have, let's say 10%. So let's say have 10% reading from African academics and African scholars, and everyone says, oh, well, we're now at 10%, that's a success. And what you've done is you've done the bare minimum. And that happens a lot of the time. So while I do agree with encouragement and maybe quotas, I also understand that quotas can in themselves be sort of a hindrance, may actually sort of hinder this engagement that we're seeking. So I don't know the exact solution to that, but I don't think that we should just say, well, have a quota. I think that it needs to go beyond the concept of, the quota. So have a quota, but it has to be supported by something else. If not, the basement becomes the ceiling. And then someone who's got, so if you say 10%, someone who's got 9% will go, yeah, we're nearly there, and you're nearly at the basement. So I do think we should have some sort of quotas. Is there a mailing list we can sign up to join FACE? Yes, I think I mentioned, let me go back to my PowerPoint, because I never remember what our email address is. So our email address, just for those who have joined in late, because I know quite a number of people joined late, our email address is foreverafrica@outlook.com. So foreverafrica@outlook.com is our email address, and you're welcome. Everyone is welcome to join the FACE team. Like I said, it's a student staff team. It's based in Bristol. It's not limited. Its membership is not limited to the University of Bristol, as long as we are engaging in, or we have similar visions and aims, then that would be fine. Yes, as I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not really going to say that, BAME and again, so there's a question about BAME and vulnerability to COVID. I'm a lawyer, so I'm really about, language and laws. What else do I want to say about that? So and also I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm not going to talk about vulnerability. I do, however, teach on a unit, so I teach a topic on a unit about, sort of law and medicine, about race, law and medicine. So there is a history and I'm not going to give you a lecture on race, law and medicine, but things that we need to think about is that race is socially constructed. There's no scientific basis to classification by race. BAME is a term that I do not use and I do not encourage the use of. It is inaccurate in the extreme. And I will share one of the things I've written. So a couple of things I've written, I will share that on the Slido link so that you can see. But I would say on COVID and BAME, just a few things to point out. Because I'm not an epidemiologist, I don't want to give any scientific advice. I'm also a lawyer who's aware of liability for statements, so not going to say too much about that, but I will share a couple of links on that. We've got about, see, we have a few more minutes. Note that the seminar is going to be recorded, so if anyone missed it, well, it's being recorded. I will try and upload it. We'll see how that goes. Let's see. Yeah, the role of land is like, again, there's someone's talked about the role of land. So someone asked a question about the role of land. Do we explore the role of land in relation to racism within the African context? So the idea of land is actually quite important to me. And a lot of my current research is on the epistemologies of land. So the legal epistemologies of land. So what do we think about land in a legal sense? And I think, and again, I'm going to try not to lecture, but when I talk about the using our current epistemologies to achieve freedom. So when we go, into contexts like, let's say, you go into an African context and you're trying to talk about land rights, we're using our current knowledges about land to try and achieve justice in a completely different context. But it should be noted that across Africa, prior to colonization, land wasn't considered to be property. If you think about what land looks like, it is the weirdest sort of property. It's not movable. It's, it's not like a car or a house or shoes or a bag. It's land. It's like, air. Why do we say we can own it? So our starting point is usually steeped in the epistemology that we have. So yes, we do. So one of the things, so hopefully the next few steps we're going to take within FACE is really focused on these sorts of epistemologies, but that's not the only epistemology that exists. Dr. Farah Hassani, often talks about, the concept of the body as well. So, how do we think about the body within science? So there are lots of epistemologies that we could talk about. We cannot exhaust all of them. So what we hope to do in FACE is to, provide this, like I said, epistemological space to be able to ask these questions that are not usually asked because they so much subvert the sort of normative knowledge context. Yeah. So that because I don't want to exceed the time that I've given for myself here. I said 25 minutes for talk, 25 minutes for questions. If there are no other questions, there are no other questions. Unicots predominantly affecting Black casualized staff. You have any thoughts on how FACE learnings can be mobilized to resist this? As our focus currently is very much, is very much on sort of knowledge systems. I don't think FACE's work can directly resist this. However, to put it in a slightly different way, it is, I would say, almost ridiculous for a university to be trying to decolonize and then leave out or sort of get rid of the people who are producing the knowledge that you're trying to use to decolonize. So, and which is what, exactly what we're saying. So while we're not a pressure group in that sense, and I think, especially at the last conference, there was a lot, talking about how we're a parallel space. Because I think there's a danger, and again, this was also mentioned at the first conference, there's a danger to say, I want to eat at the table, I want to eat at this table, when the problem is the table exists. So it's a long-term plan rather than a short-term plan. So on the one hand, I agree, universities and, in our sort of almost personal capacities and in a group capacity, we're saying, well, universities should not be cutting Black staff. But we're also saying that there's a long-term plan, we have a long-term vision where we should be thinking more about how to create a knowledge, producing a knowledge transmission system where these questions don't even arise. And that would be my answer. Yeah. So next question is, how has FACE found working within, within Bristol University? Certain parts of that question, I'll say email me directly, because there's some responses that I will not want to record and put up here. But I would say, as with any other, working with any other massive institution, there have been trials and triumphs. I think for me, the major thing has been how much students have taught me personally. They, like I said earlier, they have been so enthusiastic. They have questioned me, about things that, because this is the thing, you think you're doing work to liberation, but you're also steeped into the language of oppression. There are things you're not thinking of. But working with students, to me, I would say is the absolute best. Anyone who hasn't done it should try it. Students will ask you, they will question you when you think you are right. So I think working with students within Bristol University has been my absolute joy. They're so lovely. Working with the organization, like I said, trials and triumphs. If you want details, contact me personally and I will tell you what those trials and triumphs are. And I suspect that you will have the same ups and downs working with almost any other university in higher education in almost any country, to be honest. So University of Bristol has actually been in many ways, and lots of members of staff have been so supportive. Without my colleagues, this will not be happening. So there has been massive support across the board. Yeah. Let's just see, do I have any more questions? No, so I think in the absence of any more questions, I want you to be able to go and sort of have at least 5 minutes to relax before the next thing. Thank you for joining us on this webinar. I really appreciate your attendance and all the questions that I have been asked. Remember, if you want to join us in face, our email is foreverafrica@outlook.com. Email me. And yeah, follow me on Twitter, because I tend to do quite a lot of ranting and raving on Twitter as well. And everything that happens in face, I always talk about on Twitter. But if you're not a Twitterer, you can email me and I will communicate with you that way. So either the email in which I sent the registration or the foreverafrica@outlook.com. In the absence of any other questions, thank you so much. Have a lovely afternoon, and I hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much. Thank you.